Hi class, and welcome to our final lecture for this summer session class, The Documented Life. So far it's been a real pleasure working with all of you through these ideas. It's been insightful for me to be able to hear your ideas and points of view on all the things that we've been talking about, and it's been fascinating and eye-opening to me. So thanks for a fantastic course this semester. And I wanted to end this class by looking at the idea of what we're going to do with all of this data that we are documenting, all of the documents that we're creating and curating. What's going to happen to all of these objects that we are producing in the future? And ultimately, the question that also accompanies this is, how is this affecting our memory? And this has been a question that's actually been throughout the ages in terms of media being a part of our lives since Plato's era. As soon as writing was introduced, Plato argued that, sure, writing is good for certain things, but the effects are that our memories will be degraded, because we won't be forced to remember things, we can just write them down. And we hear many similar sentiments with emerging technologies, that you don't have to remember a phone number, it's stored in your phone. You don't have to remember something, you can just Google it. So this is a very old claim, and one of the questions that continues to reiterate in our society from previous eras is, what is the effects of media on our memory? And one of the things that Wendy Chun wrote in her article, which I actually had pulled out, initially I was going to have you read it, and at the last minute I decided to pull it out because it didn't quite accomplish what I had hoped it would. But one of the things that she points out that I do want to bring up anyway is that we tend to conflate the idea of storage and memory. That storage and memory are somehow linked, that we can imagine storing our photographs, storing our videos on an external hard drive or in the cloud, and then it will be preserved. And that this will allow us to go back to it and have a sense of our memories, but also that our memories are then, in one aspect, perhaps freed up for other things, because we don't have to remember those things. We can just offload it to the big data that we're producing. And then, on the other hand, that these documents that we're producing are part of our memories as well, that the act of documenting and storing is an act of a certain type of relationship to memory. So that, I think, is an interesting concept. What is the effect of these documents and this era of big data on our own personal ability to remember things? And again, will the document stand in for a memory? One of the first things I brought up was a photograph of my first birthday party, and that this is actually a stand-in for a memory that's non-existent. What happens when we have massive amounts of documentation of our lives, where it becomes just an essential part of our lives? What will the effects be on our memory? And Matt Kirschenbaum's article, I think, points to some interesting points to this, and Carrie Krauss as well, thinking about the fragility of archiving, I think is the reason I brought those articles in, because there isn't this solid, dependable way of archiving the things that are perhaps most important to us now, these digital documents that we are producing. And I had you read my chapter on storytelling, because essentially one of the aspects that I see as being important for the archiving of digital media is the storage of these stories that are ephemeral, these oral histories of place, and that would vanish otherwise if they weren't being documented by digital media, and what digital media is actually doing in terms of making interventions in the realm of cultural heritage. You have all of these histories, you have all of this meaningful data, meaningful stories, meaningful perspectives about a range of things, from what a particular street corner means to what the city of DC means. So how do we gather that, archive it, and allow it to be something that's accessible to future generations? And I want to tie this back to one of the things I said in last week's lectures, which is space and place are different. That essentially place is when we practice a space and make it meaningful. We imbue it with our own stories. And actually, we don't have even a concept of a story and a place as being separate. A place exists because we tell the stories about it. Now, the interesting thing is, for cultural heritage and for archiving and the histories of space, is that there are a range of stories that could be told about a place that make it meaningful, but oftentimes those stories don't get told. Only the powerful stories get told. Only the stories of those with wealth that are able to produce durable media are the stories that we hear. And for Walter Benjamin, in a different article that he wrote, Thesis on the Philosophy of History, he says that capturing these stories, being able to tell the stories of history, is the most important battle that we can engage in a culture. Because ultimately, the victor's stories will always be heard, and the stories of those on the margins will always get lost. Digital media, I think, are making some interesting interventions to allow for what I call polyvocality. In other words, many voices to be heard, conflicting voices, voices that tell different stories, not just the grand narrative. The grand narrative is like the idea that there is a cohesive whole story that always gets told about what the Lincoln Memorial means, just as an example, or any site on the National Mall. There's a grand narrative to it. But there are a range of stories about what that site means, and often conflicting stories about it, what it means. And mobile media especially are allowing us to layer all these stories onto a single spot and tell a range of conflicting, complementary stories that would not be told otherwise. And this, I think, is the power of something like mobile technologies, to be able to intervene in these, to be able to allow these stories to be told, which is one of the most important battles that we will fight in our culture, is to be able to allow for a range of stories to be documented and told, not just the grand narratives. And the Kirschenbaum piece, and Matt Kirschenbaum and Carrie Krause are professors here at the University of Maryland, and I should also mention that Hassan Elahi, who we looked at his Tracking Transients project, is also a professor at our university. Kirschenbaum's piece, the overarching point of it, and the reason that I brought it in, is to think of when we're documenting these things, when we think about the documented life, and even the action of taking something like a story and disseminating it for a wide range of people to hear. The documented life is not just about those kinds of actions. It's not just about the intentional stories of me recording your voice about a story that's meaningful to you. It's not just about me taking a picture or a video. In other words, from Kirschenbaum's point of view, anything you do online is a part of the documented life. Anything you do with a computer leaves a trace. Every contact leaves a trace, going off of this forensic idea. Essentially, you are being documented in everything that you do. So the documented life is not just about the intentional documentation of our lives. It's often about just simply being present in online spaces and leaving traces on hard disks. So the other aspect that I find important about this piece is that ultimately the documented life is about the physicality of our media. That we are actually inscribing things onto hard disks, both on your personal computer, on your phone, and on the cloud, on servers out there. There are physical traces of your life online that you don't necessarily have any idea exists, but we are leaving massive amounts of data behind just simply by being present in digital spaces. That the digital is physical here. It's very physical, and that's a part of the documented life, that we are leaving traces that often are unintentional. We are just leaving our presence here in a wide range of ways. And for Carrie Krause, then extending this idea is to say, what do we do with all of this data? How are we going to archive it? And we tend to think of the digital as being the dominant medium for archiving, because it's just digits. It doesn't degrade in the same way that a cassette tape does. But her point is that that's not actually true, that there is this degradation of media, because when you think about the digital as physical, it's not just the numbers, it's how those numbers get conveyed. It's the various systems and hard drives and computers that let you access that information, and all of that stuff is degrading and becoming obsolescent. You have these floppy disks, like Matt Kirschenbaum's piece, that where are you going to find the floppy drive to be able to read that? And if you do find the floppy drive, is there even software to be able to access it and read it? Increasingly, the answer is no. So you stored something on a digital medium, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, are you going to be able to find a computer that actually reads that USB drive, or that reads that CD or DVD that you burned your photographs to? The answer may be no. That computers won't have a DVD player or a DVD-ROM. So how are you going to access all of those important files on a DVD that you stored? And the other aspect is a DVD is itself very physical and degrades. And we think of it as a digital medium, but it's very tangible, very physical. And as a plastic, resin, polymer, it's made up of all of these various materials, but those are actually degrading and dissolving, and to the point where you may not be able to access them in the future. And another aspect that I find very interesting for her work is talking about video games. And I think back to the first video games that I played, either on an Atari 2600 or on a Commodore, and even think about the first video game that you played, what that might be. How will your children access that game? The answer is probably an emulator, a computer that will emulate what it was like. But if you think again about the physicality of digital media, the experience of a video game is not just what happens on the screen, it's about what the controller felt like in your hand. It's about how you inserted an N64 disc into the gaming console, for example. All of these things matter for the experience of playing it. And how do you archive something like that? How do you document something like game studies? And especially when you think about, it's not trivial because games are the most dominant medium on the face of the entertainment medium that we have right now. It has outsold film box offices since about 2000. So for the last 14 years, the dominant medium in terms of sales for entertainment has been video games. It's a dominant cultural force. So in, again, 15 years, how are we going to access the games that we play on the Xbox or PlayStations? If this is an important medium for our generations, how will future generations actually experience this? How will we document something that is physical and very specific to a single machine? It's an interesting question that we're going to face, and I think this all brings up various facts that the documented life is not, again, just about what we're producing, the photographs, but it's about the systems and machines and physical hardware that we're using to produce these. And these are all going to be obsolete in a handful of years. What are we going to do to access these various documents and various experiences that are very much attached to specific machines, a specific phone or a specific game console? And she ends her piece, or has in her piece a fascinating point that I think is worth ending on for this lecture, that essentially we cannot document, we cannot archive all of the data that we're producing. We are producing massive amounts of data, like I talked about in the previous lecture. There's no way to archive all of that. And what this fact points us to is that we're going to have to make some choices about what we do archive and how we archive it. And what you decide to archive, what you decide you want to carry with you beyond the specific computers that you're using right now into the future for future generations to be able to access, reveals some fascinating things about what you hold dear as an individual and what our culture holds important. What we decide to archive in the era of big data, what we decide to document for future generations, archive, curate, and make sure is accessible, will reveal the things that we hold dear as a culture. And I think this is just a good moment to pause and say, what are those things that you're producing, those documents that you are creating that you think ought to be archived for future generations? How are you going to accomplish that? And ultimately, thinking through those questions reveals the things that we hold valuable in our own lives. The documents that we want to preserve point us to some interesting things that about our own values as a culture. So I want to end this lecture here, and what I'm going to do next is give you a quick overview of the course. I just wanted to give you a summary of all the various things that we've talked about throughout this short summer session.